Hi, and welcome to your second bridging lesson, um, your virtual bridging lesson. We've looked at Twelfth Night together, and now we're going to look at how we might study some dystopian fiction in A-level literature at QE. Right, what is dystopian fiction? Probably you've got a pretty good idea. It's a little bit too relevant for our times at the moment, isn't it? I've got a link on here if you'd like to read more about the history of dystopian fiction. And I think this handy visual aid in a utopia, trees are green, everything's nice, everything's wonderful. And in a dystopian world, it's kind of the opposite now. A tree there becomes a nuclear mushroom cloud. Although it's a little bit more complex than that, because in any dystopia, there's always a group of people, a set of characters for whom that world is a utopia. So Margaret Atwood, one of the writers whose works we will study in depth, prefers the term us-topia because it's always a little bit of a blend of both. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to compare the openings of our two set texts, 1984 by George Orwell and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. If you'll indulge my reading voice for a little bit, it's not often that we read to you in our lessons. And of course, if you don't want that to happen, just pause the video and read it yourself by all means. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast, in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a coloured poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Right, so at this point you might want to pause the video, you might want to go back and look at those slides. But in a lesson, this is what we would be doing. We would be choosing key quotations that help us understand how we know that this is from a dystopian text. And here are 3 I prepared earlier. If you chose something completely different, or you didn't choose anything at all, it's completely fine. The clocks were striking 13. It's an incredibly famous opening line. Obviously, we do have, the 24-hour clock, but we would never say that the clocks were striking 13. So instantly, it's like, this is a bit weird. And I guess that's the clue when we're reading dystopian fiction. Anything that feels a little bit odd, a little bit out of kilter. And then what's going on here? It was part of the economy drive. Well, an economy drive is when everyone gathers together to to save money, to put money towards something. But this is, something done within a society in preparation for Hate Week. As though Hate Week is something completely normal and that everybody is on board with. Apologies if you can hear my toddler in the background screaming his head off as he has to eat his lunch. It's Hate Week every day for him. And finally, Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. A feature of dystopian fiction is one of constant surveillance, where individual citizens are always being watched, always being scrutinised, and that you can't escape the idea that whoever or whatever is in charge is watching you and that you will be held accountable for your actions. Okay, let's carry on. So let's have a look at The Handmaid's Tale, which was written 40 years later. Atwood herself has said that she couldn't have written The Handmaid's Tale without the influence of Orwell's 1984. And as we go on in the lessons together, we'll talk about where Orwell himself got his influences from, because context is a massive part of our understanding of this dystopian fiction. We're not going to touch on it in this little brief bridging lesson, but in our lessons we'd be thinking, right, what are these writers responding to in the 40s when they were writing, in the 80s when they were writing? Bit longer this one, so let's hope there are no screaming children throughout. We slept in what had once been the gymnasium. The floor was of varnished wood with stripes and circles painted on it for the games that were formerly played there. The hoops for the basketball nets were still in place, though the nets were gone. A balcony ran around the room for the spectators, and I thought I could smell, faintly, like an after-image, the pungent scent of sweat shot through with the sweet taint of chewing gum and perfume from the watching girls. Felt skirted, as I knew from pictures, later in miniskirts, then pants, then in one earring, spiky green streaked hair. Dances would have been held there. The music lingered, a palimpsest of unheard sound, style upon style, an undercurrent of drums, a forlorn wail, garlands made of tissue paper flowers, cardboard devils, a revolving ball of mirrors, powdering the dancers with a snow of light. There was old sex in the room, and loneliness, and expectation of something without a shape or name. I remember that yearning for something that was always about to happen and was never the same as the hands that were on us there and then, in the small of the back or out back, in the parking lot, or in the television room with the sound turned down and only the pictures flickering over lifting flesh. We yearned for the future. How did we learn it, that talent for insatiability? It was in the air, and it was still in the air, an afterthought as we tried to sleep. In the army cots that had been set up in rows, with spaces between so we could not talk. We had flannelette sheets, like children's, and army-issue blankets, old ones that still said US. We folded our clothes neatly and laid them on the stools at the ends of the beds. The lights were turned down but not out. Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth patrolled. They had electric cattle prods slung on thongs from their leather belts. No guns, though. Even they could not be trusted with guns. Guns were for the guards, specially picked from the angels. The guards weren't allowed inside the building, except when called, and we weren't allowed out except for our walks, twice daily, 2 by 2 around the football field, which was enclosed now by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The angels stood outside it with their backs to us. They were objects of fear to us, but of something else as well. If only they would look. If only we could talk to them. Something could be exchanged, we thought. Some deal made, some trade-off. We still had our bodies. That was our fantasy. We learned to whisper almost without sound. In the semi-darkness we could stretch out our arms, when the ants weren't looking, and touch each other's hands across space. We learned to lip read, our heads flat on the beds, turned sideways, watching each other's mouths. In this way we exchanged names from bed to bed. Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira, June. A longer piece, that's the very first chapter from a section entitled Night, but I wanted to go a little bit further with that one, and because there's a lot more going on with atmosphere, with characterisation. So maybe pause the video, take a few minutes to reread the slides, and I'll see you at the next one. Okay, so what are the kinds of things that we might want to discuss here? The setting's interesting. The hoops for the basketball nets were still in place, though the nets were gone. Whatever's happened here is recent. Let's think of comparing that with the setting in 1984, where it seems like that setting of dust and grit and dirt and the smell of boiled cabbage has been around a long time. Why are these women being held in a school gym? Think now of your halls at school, where you've done PE, where you've had assemblies, where you've seen plays. And now that's been converted and there are women imprisoned there. Why? What's the atmosphere like? The atmosphere in 1984 seemed incredibly depressing, incredibly dull, hopeless. Here, it's not quite as hopeless because again of the recent nature of events. The speaker is picking up on that sense of yearning for something, the next thing to happen, and that's still there here. But that's impinged upon by the control as we try to sleep in the army cots that have been set up in rows. A cot just means like a camp bed in this novel. But with deliberate space, it's left so that these women may not talk. Surveillance. We have the poster in 1984, Big Brother is watching you. And here we have Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth. Why are they called ants? Why would ants have electric cattle prods hanging from their dresses? We also have these men, the angels, who always have their back to the women, who are not allowed into the room with the women. We're looking in dystopian novels as well for the individual. A dystopian novel will often feature one or more characters who rise up and challenge the regime. Is there any sense of that already in these opening pages? Well, maybe not so much in 1984, but let's think about our character's name, Winston Smith. And here we see that the women have learned to adapt to their circumstances. They've learned to lip read, and what they exchange are their names. So, just a few things to think about. Again, what we would have done in the lesson is you'd have discussed those, you'd have shared your ideas. A key feature of teaching lit at QE is that it's very student led. There's very little of myself, Dean or Claire standing at the front and just lecturing you. That's no fun for anybody. Okay, so you've been very patient and you've listened to the background family noise here. What happens in the exam? Well, section B, I think we'll start with there first. You will compare those two novels, 1984 and Handmaid's Tale, and you'll compare a dystopian theme within it, maybe surveillance, maybe the idea of the individual. You will also be able to bring in any wider reading that you've done. Section A is a bit different. I have to admit this would kind of be my favourite part of both of the exams. You are given an unseen extract from a dystopian text. It's very unlikely that you will recognise it. And then you're basically asked to write a critical appreciation of it. What that means is, how do you know it's dystopian? What are the features that you're looking for? And we practice that a lot, and you'll be given a booklet with unseen extracts in that we'll go through all of the time. The best thing you can do for that is your own wider reading, so that you're an expert in the dystopian genre. This is a nice little video from YouTube about how to recognise a dystopian, so please watch that at your leisure. And I'd better end there again with my email address. If there's anything you want to ask, please get in touch. Hope you enjoyed watching that as much as I enjoyed making it. And I can't wait to see you all in September. Take care.